All right, everyone. Today we're going to be going through the second lecture for Inequalities and Intersectionality. Additionally, I am going to be going over a sort of case study in my own research so you can start to understand with real-world examples, for at least anthropology, how some of these different concepts intersect with each other. But first, we should talk about men, and in particular, the concept of masculinity. Because in your reading, I hope you got this, that there really is different ways to define masculinity. Really, there's different ways of describing and defining everything. But your point of view is going to change how you perceive the world, of course. So there can be considered to be four broad concepts for what masculinity means, at least how they have been used in the literature. The first is masculinity is anything that men think and do. It's pretty broad, but also it loses some nuance, of course. Then we have masculinity is anything men think and do to be men. This goes into performance. How do I perform my masculinity when I walk out of the door? Is it based on the clothes I'm wearing? Is it how I'm interacting with other people? Is it how I'm interacting with either the opposite sex or my own sex? And what do those interactions look like? Then, in terms of a comparison, we have some men are inherently or by description considered more manly than other men. Think about cultural norms concerning what it means to be a man. Are you, for instance, traditionally in the United States, this means that you are the provider for a family, you take charge, you are the alpha male in a sense. And then this is always in comparison to the individuals that don't fit that label as neatly as we understand masculinity to be. Then we have the sort of contrary opinion that masculinity is considered anything that women are not. There's masculine, there's feminine, and to be less masculine is to be more feminine. All these different approaches and ways of thinking are based, of course, in cultural understandings and histories concerning how people perceive themselves and how they perceive others. But these have implications, especially when you are talking about different cultures interacting, because different cultures have different understandings of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. And this can have consequences when there is some tension between different groups of individuals. Not just outside of your culture and the interactions that happen there, but also within that particular culture, because people have different understandings and perceptions of what it means to be a certain category that people prescribe onto you and that you prescribe yourself. What I'm really talking about here are cultural regions and also the boundaries that separate cultures, supposedly at least. Questions of virility and definitions of manliness have often been played out in the cultural confrontations between colonizer and colonized. And this has resulted in two largely contradictory trends developed due to colonialism. The first is that colonized men are viewed as less masculine and sexual. In a sense, they are, going back in the roots of slavery, they were discussed as they were more base, almost animal-like, compared to us, the virile, masculine individual who is spreading civilization across the world, for the betterment, of course, as the mentality was, and sometimes is today, of the other. Then we have the colonized or non-Western men were later viewed as more masculine and sexual. This is sort of the noble savage trope, which I've mentioned before in this class. Basically, to give an example, indigenous individuals, let's say Native Americans in the United States, were considered to be, in anthropology especially, how they were written, as more masculine, more true to their real nature. They weren't cowed, and basically culture hasn't, and civilization hasn't beat manliness out of them. Of course, there's some problematics, no matter how you look at this, for good reason, because really it's contradictory, because on the one hand, some individuals might perceive the other as less masculine due to certain cultural traits, but that same individual may prescribe different cultural traits as more masculine than something that they themselves do. So it occupies a sort of Schrodinger's cat's box of sorts where an individual can be more or less masculine than yourself based on different cultural traits that you are prescribing to masculinity, which really just shows you how these are social constructs that really have no meaning beyond the meaning that we give them. Meaning and meaning making really boil down to the spoken versus the unspoken word, which I've gotten into in some capacity in previous lectures in this class. So some quotes here that sort of encapsulate what I'm trying to say is much of what anthropologists have written about masculinity must be inferred from research on women and by extrapolation from studies on other topics. If we say women lack power, we are also saying men have more power, which is often the case, of course. However, we must also account for race, economics, sexuality, and other factors. Again, intersectional identities can influence an individual's level of power in a given society, their level of power in a given conversation they're having with someone else. But what this quote here at the top is trying to say is that since the majority of researchers, especially in anthropology in our history, were men, primarily white men, they really just took being a man for granted. They would look at the other. They would look at, for instance, women in a given society, even though it is very problematic to study women as men sometimes because of the barriers that sort of are placed in front of you. Doesn't mean it's impossible, it's just difficult. But since women primarily were not doing field work in the history of anthropology, we were having to make inferences, I mean we as an anthropologist, about what we were seeing in front of us based on how women were interacting with us and how we were perceiving them in their given culture or society. So, for instance, if we were seeing that women primarily did domestic duties while men went out and hunted, for example, we may prescribe ethnocentric understandings of those gender roles to mean, oh, women have less power. Because in our cultural history, men going out of the house and providing for their family meant that they were the ones in charge. However, let's say a woman went to that same field site, and what she found was actually women have a lot of power in their given society because of the homemaking position that they find themselves in. It may have prescribed more power than what it does, or what it did, at least in the United States. But what we are seeing often is colored by the lens in which we are approaching a topic from. This is not to say that, of course, the patriarchy does not exist. It very much does exist in most of the known world. But also there is a lot more nuance, and we can't just make it as black and white as women are homemakers, therefore they have less power. Again, generally the case, but we cannot always say that. And of course, these trends change over time, and we're increasingly seeing women being able to, in the so-called developing world, find employment. But there are still very real barriers, and in a sense, this is why they're called developing countries, and in that, in our history of the United States, we have started to see a very large cultural shift in what jobs women have access to, of course. But there are still very much a lot more barriers in certain other countries that have more so-called traditional gender roles. Traditional, of course, is based on history, but also is culturally mediated and determined. And something we may be seeing as, okay, in our culture we do this, we're seeing something similar there. We can't necessarily prescribe the same reasons behind that behavior based on our own experience, because there could be a very different context informing and shaping that experience. All right, so a bit about my research before I dive headfirst into this topic. This is going to be basically a small, again, case study based on my fieldwork. This is not extensive, and I will go into more of my research in the medical anthropology chapter and section of this class, but think of this as a snapshot, really, of something that I'm trying to convey here based on what I'm discussing in this presentation. So where I do work at is called Key Cocker Island. We would probably say K, but because of the linguistic quirks of being a, at one point, British colony, they say some things a little bit different than us. So this is Key Cocker, Belize, a very small island off the northeastern coast of the country of Belize. which is about a 2.5 hour plane ride southwest from Florida. I'm particularly hyper-focusing here on circumstances of catcalling I saw among my participants as these men were interacting with either island women or also foreign tourists as well. This area that you're seeing here is called the drag or the tourist strip. It's where the majority of tourists will congregate. And for the most part, they don't really ever leave this spot when they're on the island. They might go to the northern island to go to the resort there, but they don't really go to the residential areas where a lot of islanders live. And that has some implications in terms of what the local village council, basically the governing body, does concerning, for instance, keeping the island so-called beautiful or pretty where is a very good example of disparities in terms of the environment that can occur based on economic ideations and really capitalism also too. So I'm going to be outlining a dilemma that I actually had, and if this was in the classroom, I usually like to ask students if you thought, after hearing what I had to say, if I'd made the right decision. I still really don't know, and that's because ethnography, the practice of doing fieldwork as an anthropologist primarily, is incredibly difficult and very gray a lot of the times. It's not so much a black and white scenario. This is because often you are dealing with cultural contexts that are outside of your own, and also as a researcher in anthropology, you have an ethical mandate not to do any harm. But harm is a very amorphous topic. Am I talking about embarrassing a participant? Am I talking about physical harm? Really, it's left ambiguous because of the local nuances are always going to be difficult to navigate if you have a so-called list of things that you can or cannot do. Because, again, cultures are very different from each other, and something that you may think is abnormal or wrong may be the norm in a given culture or society. So with that context, I was sort of hanging out with 4 Creole men. These are self-identified men that identify as Creole. And hanging out as an anthropologist means you're doing participant observation. I am taking notes, I'm observing behavior, I'm seeing what these men do on a daily basis, and also I'm building rapport. Basically, I'm slowly becoming their friend in a sense, but at the same time, I also am a researcher. So you have to try and juggle being close to your participants and also having some objectivity as a researcher while you are hanging out with them and hopefully doing your best to kind of blend in the background so your presence does not disrupt them or change the behaviors that they would normally be doing. If you hear the leaf blower, I apologize. So what I was seeing as I was hanging out in the tourist district of the island was that there was some friction between working with these men while also being a feminist researcher. That's what I identify as, among other titles, of course. For instance, participants were catcalling, basically hitting on and approaching women, even openly propositioning them, primarily tourist women. I say primarily tourist women because, for instance, when a local islander woman would walk by and she was catcalled, she often would curse back to the men, jokingly say something in return, in rebuttal, and then walk away, and that was largely the end of the discussion. Because that woman has a different cultural understanding and is able to more comfortably navigate that space. However, when I was seeing tourist women getting approached by the local men that I was hanging out with, oftentimes they seemed uncomfortable. And they would either avert their eyes, they would walk quickly, being followed shortly by the men before they gave up essentially, or they would stop and listen to what they had to say. We would call this misogynist language in feminist studies and just general feminist understandings, which you can kind of think of as so-called locker room talk. And that, of course, is a very problematic term. But at the end of the day, what I was seeing here was a practice that I wasn't comfortable with, because I was seeing language and actions that I felt went beyond interactions into the realm of misogyny or sexual harassment even. But remember, as an anthropologist, I'm there to study the tourists. I'm here to study the male participants, not the tourists. So my ethical duty really, is to make sure I'm not harming the male participants. The issue is if I were to intervene, let's say in an issue of catcalling or a woman feeling uncomfortable, at least as far as I can tell, I may be embarrassing potentially my participant, making him seen as either, I don't even put it in terms of being a predator, or in terms of being made fun of by his other friends who were watching the interaction because I stopped him from doing something, for instance. Additionally, me hanging out with these men, I often was offered, and that was the language that I'm going to use because I'm operationalizing that, an island girlfriend. The implication was they wanted me, for instance, to hang out with a prostitute. I declined their offer multiple times, but it was still something that they kind of made fun of me for being on an island primarily visited by tourists and being by myself for the most part. It was all in fun and it was joking, but there was that extra layer of discomfort with me being a feminist that I largely was not comfortable with. Before I move on, I should also mention, of course, I'm a medical anthropologist, so I'm primarily focused on infectious diseases, including Zika virus, which is spread by mosquitoes, and also sexual transmission, blood transfusion, and also during pregnancy. But additionally, I was keenly aware that my participants had already mentioned they don't like using condoms because they don't feel good, and in Belize, condom use is very low, while at the same time, HIV/AIDS is very high in the country. So I'm seeing instances of catcalling, I'm seeing instances of men walking away with women that agreed to hang out with them, while at the same time I just heard him say he doesn't like to wear a condom. An extra layer of morally gray space for me as a researcher, researching the men. Additionally, just so you have an understanding of this, there was this sort of language that the men would use to talk about someone that basically quote-unquote caught a tourist woman. They would be called tour guides among their friends. Basically, he would say, I'm going to give you a tour of the island. I know the island better than anyone else here. I can show you all the spots that other people might not know about. And then there was always the implication that if I do this, there's going to be some reciprocal exchange, and either in terms of buying drinks, giving money, or sexual favors. So there's a lot really to unpack here, and this shows that depending on your topic, you can have some really messy interactions with participants that you need to be able to navigate. And if you don't feel comfortable, of course, get out of the situation, but be able to do that in a way where your participants don't feel they have been slighted or outed by your actions. So let's add a little extra messiness to this context. So I mentioned tour guides, and this is linked to sex tourism, which is a very lucrative profession in Latin America especially, which predominantly involves white European or American women or men going to so-called exotic places and finding a good time with a local individual. Of course, with some compensation in mind. What this really largely manifests in what I was seeing in Kikaker was that women around the island were looking for a good time in some situations. They weren't always declining the men that were approaching them. So the typical exchange, if I were to sort of itemize it, was that a man would approach and or catcall a woman. He would make his sales pitch, again saying, hey, I know the island better than anyone. I can show you a good time. I can show you all the good spots around the island. And if he succeeded, he would gain social capital. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, social capital basically means respect. He would gain respect with his friends who saw the interaction and saw that he scored, in a sense. Or if he got rejected, he might lose social capital with the men. Seeing that he got rejected, he might get made fun of and then come back defeated, basically. If I, as an anthropologist, stepped in and intervened when I felt uncomfortable with what I was seeing, then I might reduce his social capital by making a scene, basically, out of the situation when it could have been potentially just diffused by the woman walking by. And again, women are not helpless, of course. So is it really my right or duty to intervene? I would say no, if I felt that she was not in danger, of course. But again, what does that really mean for a tourist staying on an island for a couple of days? As I mentioned, my participants in the study were the men, not tourist women. Women are not helpless, and some reciprocated men's advances. However, others looked visibly uncomfortable. Feeling an ally to women, or at least I tried to be, versus being a white male savior for predominantly white men, go back to Abu Lagod, for instance, that always crosses my mind when I'm trying to be an ally, for instance. This applies to both anthropological work, but also just in normal interactions. To some degree, you don't want to speak for someone, but also you want to help, of course, as best as you can. But to navigate that space is also it also gets complicated. Speaking of complications, we must also look at political economy. Being a tour guide involves both sexual as well as monetary compensation. And the men in my study are very poor compared to typical tourist women who can afford to travel to this destination. What I am saying here is that what we really are seeing are tourists that can afford to travel abroad, interacting with men who are literally working hand to mouth sometimes, working odd jobs, barely scraping by to be able to afford a living. They can sometimes get compensated with money or the buying of food or the buying of drinks if they get a woman essentially to follow him around the island as a tour guide as his role. So again, is it my place to intervene? Is it my place to potentially deny him a source of income that he may have received if I did not intervene? Again, anthropology is hard work and it's difficult, and I'm bringing this up because we must also think about the context in which people are coming from, because your experiences are going to shape how you see the world, how you behave in this world, and how you expect others to behave. So, what did I do? You may have already got this from me, but I did nothing. I did not directly harm participants because I did not intervene when I was seeing catcalling. However, from a feminist perspective, my silence as a man seeing women sexually objectified can, or it does, make me culpable and or promote future misogyny. Again, you have to wear different hats, especially when you're an anthropologist, but also just as a normal human being. Different understandings may conflict with each other, and then you have to decide what is the best answer. It's a difficult task to tell yourself. It's a difficult task to expect of others, but also you may think this is an easy decision. So if you thought that I made the wrong decision by not intervening, or if I could have done something else, feel free to send me an email. Maybe we can talk about it. However, I would say I got good data from witnessing these interactions. I was able to write about in my research for my thesis, for my article that I wrote in a journal, about this catcalling behavior, about the problematics of sexual harassment and not wearing condoms in an area that has a high infectious disease burden. So sometimes a difficult area can be fruitful in terms of research, but you have to think about the cost-benefit analysis of doing so also too. These things can be complicated, and there really isn't a right answer, because what is the right answer to you may be different than what it is for me. Switching gears towards queer anthropology, which often is conflated with feminist anthropology. They are very similar areas, and they come from similar backgrounds. However, they also diverge in particular areas. How they overlap is that there is resistance to hegemonic and heteronormative conceptions of how humans are and should be. This often is the focus of LGBTQ+ topics, but is not exclusive to just that, and that's not just what they talk about either. In that podcast, think about what the presenter is trying to really argue for and the sort of the history behind this concept. In some senses, queer anthropology is in response to feminist anthropology, largely coming from a perspective of also heteronormativity, even though in more contemporaneous times it tries to counter that heteronormativity. Queer anthropology is a very encompassing field, a very open and expanding field, of course, too, given the additional letters and plus sign that we are prescribing to this title now. And of course, LGBTQ plus is not always the one that is used nowadays. You might see I at the end. There's different combinations depending on who you're speaking with. That also applies to researchers and researchers' objectives, really, when they're conducting research. Anthropology has always been a little queer, and queer here is a kind of a play on words because it is not just talking about queer as in homosexual or pansexual, etc. It's also talking about queer in the sense of being a little different, in the sense of the definition of the term. And what I mean by that is that anthropology is kind of the lame duck of the sciences. It's too soft for the hard sciences, it's too hard for the very soft sciences, the humanities, as it were. And that liminal space of kind of having your foot in two different doors while not really feeling comfortable in either has a lot of overlap also with the experiences that queer individuals also experience. But that also gives you a lens. You see things from a different point of view than someone that maybe is in a more established field, such as, let's say, the biomedical sciences or public health. You're able to critique assumptions that are being made because you are looking from the outside in a sense. On that note, we often study social norms and how they really are not normal. The dominant perspective is not always a universal perspective. That really is the core aspect of queer anthropology. Feminist anthropology critiques power structures at play that shape disparities. Queer anthropology takes that, but what it also is saying is that we must always consider the nuance when we're looking at something. It's not just as black and white as disparities. It's also looking at gender roles, it's looking at gender norms, it's looking at sexuality, it's looking at the intersection of race and sexuality. Again, feminist anthropology is starting to do this, but queer anthropology really is at the forefront of talking about these topics. I'm sure for some of you, this article kind of came out of nowhere and maybe you were a little confused, so I'm going to slowly start to unpack some of the things that were talked about. So, there are things called nonprofit and non-governmental organizations, shortened as NGOs, which basically are private or public organizations that aren't directly tied to a government body. Take, for example, Feeding Tampa Bay in Tampa, of course, a food bank that provides for the local communities that are food insecure. They are a non-governmental organization. One of the key parts of an NGO, though, is that they are often understaffed, underserviced, and lack critical amounts of resources. Feeding Tampa Bay could always use more money. They could always use more staff, and they could always use bigger buildings in which to store their goods and services. However, money is very tight, and different NGOs may compete for each other. These organizations often depend on donor funds and volunteers to stay afloat. As a result, most often operate in a constant crisis mode of we need to take action right now. To take Feeding Tampa Bay again as another example, Feeding Tampa Bay says we must continue to feed the needy members of our community. There is a long history of NGOs in terms of especially food banks of this mentality of we kind of want to build ourselves out of business. We want to get to a point where no one is food insecure anymore. But until that happens, we need to make sure that we can provide for those that are in need. One of the first food banks, the director of that food bank said, in the future, how I see food banks is that they don't exist. And what he's saying is at one point, hopefully, food insecurity will no longer be a problem. But that hasn't happened yet, and that was decades ago when he said that statement. However, this message of we need to continually market ourselves basically to be able to serve our community so we can find more funds, so we can find more volunteers, is baked into every aspect of an NGO. This is communicated to staff and to also the public and shapes how NGO volunteers conceptualize their role in these issues. I've volunteered and done research at multiple food banks in Orlando and also in Tampa Bay. And one thing I like to do when I'm doing research is to ask different volunteers, why are you volunteering? And oftentimes it's because they say, I like to do some good for the community. I think this is a pressing issue that I think needs to be addressed. Never just because, oh, it was a Saturday and I had nothing else to do. There's always a built-in sort of agenda for the good that shapes who attends these sort of organizations. That is because that is the language that they are sort of being marketed with, essentially. You don't go to a food bank to volunteer on a date, is what I'm trying to say. A quote here. Simply talking about women's use of violence continues to be a contentious issue. The reasons for this are complex and often politically situated, but the silencing of intersectional experiences sometimes seems to be at the center of it. What this is kind of saying is that when we're using terms such as violence against women, it gets a little clunky and convoluted when we're talking about women committing violence on women, as an example, or women committing violence on men. This is where terminology such as intimate partner violence comes in, IPV. However, IPV services are sort of based on a heteronormative model of violence against women. They are not often adapted to LGBTQ plus concerns. Think again about sexual violence on campus. If the norm is heterosexual women receiving or experiencing violence, that is sort of the model that a lot of IPV or gender-based violence NGOs operate under, which may silence their perspectives or miss nuances with different sorts of combinations of sexual partners, or domestic partners at that too, that may shape actually what we're seeing. And if we operate under the assumption that it's all the same, we're going to lose that local context, which would allow us to be able to better and more effectively give goods and services to address this concern, to promote education for committers of sexual assault, for instance, if we have the right language in which to talk about these issues and the right understandings and knowledge to be able to understand these issues. Building upon that discussion, the rigid differentiation between persons victimized by perpetrating violence is a key component of a discursive binary and is mapped onto a larger system of heteronormative binaries. That's complicated, so think about that for a second. Additionally, there's been critique, rightly so, for this topic. For instance, someone could either be a perpetrator or victimized by intimate partner violence in this conceptualization, but not both. You are either the aggressor or the aggressee. But oftentimes this is not the case when we're looking at, for instance, same-sex violence and domestic violence in situations that it's not as black and white as, for instance, a man battering his wife. A lot of different contexts go into this. Sometimes they are both at fault, in a sense. Not to diminish the perspectives, of course, of individuals that are battered or are survivors, but some circumstances, that is not what we're seeing. However, especially in the law, which is what this article is also addressing, the law sees the world in terms of aggressor and victim, right? It's written basically into every law and class action suit. There's the person that's at fault and the person that is aggrieved. However, this may not always be the case. We need to be able to have a wider lens when we're looking at very critical issues, of course. And again, I want to stress I am not diminishing or devaluing the experiences of women that have experienced domestic violence. However, we must also look at cases where we cannot always have this one box fits all category when we're talking about very important and sensitive issues, because there could be voices that are left out of this perspective. This is the last slide, I promise, but there are two other important concepts here I must engage with before I let you out. And that is cultural competency and counter-hegemony. So the training described in the article was motivated by the lack of culturally competent services and widespread heteronormative conceptualizations of same-sex relationships across systems. Cultural competency is sort of a buzzword now, especially in public health. And basically, what it is trying to say is that there needs to be certain training involved when you're doing a certain program or education effort that teaches people how to be sensitive to cultural understandings and nuances. This usually is in terms of, let's say, biomedical practice, so that a doctor knows, okay, does this certain cultural group often adhere to their treatment regimes concerning medication? Or do I need to integrate my pharmaceuticals with local healing practices as an example to make them more accepted? However, cultural competency to an anthropologist is a very tricky subject to navigate, because what we often end up seeing is that individuals that take so-called cultural competency training may receive a week or two of training, and afterwards they are supposedly culturally competent now. You can think of this class also in general as also trying to teach you to be culturally competent members of society. However, what does competent mean? And that can mean different things to different people. And which cultures am I talking about? Could I sit here and lecture to you all for 1 week and you'd be culturally competent with every single culture in the United States? Of course not. So, when we're talking about cultural competency, we must also talk about who is teaching it, what are they teaching, and who are they teaching it to. If the education that's supposedly making you more culturally competent is based on heteronormative conceptualizations of same-sex relationships across the entirety of systems in an effort to be generalizable, a lot of nuance is going to be left. And we may be talking about a subset of the overall population that behaves a certain way as the norm for the entire population. This can get problematic when you're talking about programs that are seeking to treat an issue as sensitive as sexual assault or gender-based violence or intimate partner violence. If we are framing education in terms of there being the battered woman and the aggressor male, what if it's two men? What if it's two women? What if it's a multi-partner collective? And this can have different implications and can lead to different consequences if, let's say, an interventionist is trained a certain way and is unprepared for what they're seeing on the ground. At the end of the day, an anthropologist says you never really are culturally competent. You can try your best, but you must have adequate information in which to sort of operationalize that competency into effective action, research, or an intervention. Now, even organizations working with marginalized communities can hold hegemonic perspectives, which shape their practice. Again, pulling from this example of the battered woman trope. If an IPV organization that is concerned with addressing gender-based violence is operating under the model of violence against women, there's going to be things lost. I'm mentioning hegemony here, because again, these are the unspoken assumptions that we sort of just give to power structures. If you are a volunteer given basically a script in which to try to assess the experiences of a battered individual, you really don't have a lot to say in what that script says. You are following the script from A to Z, essentially. So you, using that script, reifies what that NGO is trying to do. This goes into Foucault again, if you remember Michel Foucault from last week, who basically says we give a lot of power to organizations implicitly. We don't do this actively, but through our actions, we justify their actions, and we may justify problematic behaviors. This also applies to cultural practices in general. If we do things just because that's what you are supposed to do without questioning those behaviors, we may be reproducing inequalities and injustices that can have long-term implications on the health and wellness of cultural groups, especially those that are in marginalized and vulnerable positions. So I will leave you at that, and hopefully this all makes sense. And good luck on your quiz if you've not taken it yet.